So, let's say we start with like a table kind of like this, right? So we have, maybe this is like the date the album is made. This is the number of songs on the album. This is let's call this like the artist name, and then this is the name of the album. So, we could work with this data and we could run a select statement that's, like select all from albums, and that would return to us all of the data here. One issue with this is, if we have like someone changes the information here, like let's say there's a name change, right? Like Prince changes his name. You're going to have to go through all the records and update them, right? And in general, especially with SQL, where SQL is basically the database where we're relying on the information to tell us what's what, right? We only want each piece of data stored one time. In other words, you can kind of look and see, well, like each album name is unique, right? And you can imagine there's probably just, one, name per album, and like this would be unique. But for the artist name, well, here we have repetition, right? Every time that one of our artists puts out another album, we're repeating this information. And if this ever needs to change for any reason, right? When Prince changed his name, if Paul Simon changed his name, then we would have to go find all the records and update it. And, in something like SQL, we don't want to do that, right? You can imagine it's more than just that, right? It could be the artist's name. And let's say we have like artist hometown. Well, then it's the same thing. Like everywhere that we have Prince, right? This would be Minneapolis. And here, it's Minneapolis. And then here it's like New York City, right? Every time we have an album, we're repeating everything associated with Prince and with Paul Simon. So what this is suggesting, like to avoid this repetition, one thing we can do is move to a separate table, right? So you can maybe pull this column, paste that here, and pull this column, and paste that there. And now this information is more unique. Say this is like the release date of the album, and this is the name of the album. All right. And now this information will probably have a new table called artists. And this will just have the columns of like name and hometown. All right, and now think about it. Now that we have just one table of artists, we can delete this row, right? Like we only need one kind of like registry of each artist just listed one time. So this is kind of the first step, right? Is to recognize that, all right, we have like these two entities really here, and we want to reduce repetition. And the repetition is coming from every time we have an album by an artist, we don't want to have to put in their name. And we'll show you how we'll connect these in a second. This is artists. And this will be albums. So you can imagine, like where we started was we had, artist name here, right? And we had Prince. And this was the whole issue, was that we have Prince listed twice. So instead what we'll do is we'll give our artist table an ID, and we'll give Prince the ID of 1 and Paul Simon the ID of 2. These things just increment. It's like a social security number. And this will be an identifier. And we'll say this is really the artist ID. And that will be 1. And this will be 1. And now this will be 2. Okay? So you can start to see, let me just format this a little better. Right? You can start to see like how this data links up, right? So if say you want to find who is the artist that, I guess created or authored this album, The Very Best of Prince, you go to the artist ID, you see that as 1, and then you look at the artist table, the ID, and that's this value of 1. For stranger to stranger, you go to the artist ID, see that as 2, and then you look at the artist table and see that the ID linking up is 2. So now we basically have, what we did was, instead of having a name, which can change, we use what's called a primary key. And this thing has no reason to change, right? Like, it's kind of, the whole point of this ID is just an identifier, like a social security number. It in itself doesn't really have any meaning or significance, right? There's no reason to ever change it. All it is it just points to a record. When for the ID column, where this is identifying, the record or this row, that's called the primary key. All right. When we have an ID that's referencing a primary key, or referencing, like this artist ID references a different table, right? We're on the albums table, but this artist ID references a record on a different table. That's called a foreign key. All right. So the primary key, this is the identifier for the row. I don't know, for like the current row. A foreign key links a record to the primary key on a different table. All right. So here's artists. And you can see that through this is the artist ID here is a foreign key, right? Because it links to this table's primary key. Questions about that so far, right? So we're basically just describing how we are going to restructure our data with multiple tables. All right. So in terms of now how we would write this, like how we're going to query this in SQL. So you can see, I really like this Khan Academy console. Let me see if I can make it bigger. There you go. All right. So you can see I created these two tables, create table persons. I inserted in some data, create table albums, right? Also insert in some data. We can query each individual table by doing select all from albums. Let's take a look at that. And you can see this is what we have, right? We have the name of the album, the foreign key, right? And then we also have, that's it, and the primary key of the album. And now let's do the other one. Select all from artists. Oh, sorry, from persons it's called in this case. So here's our two people. So now let's say that we want to see the person's name. We want to write a query, and we want to if we're giving this to a manager or whatever, we want to not only see the album name, but we want to see the person's name right side by side. Okay? So here's what we can do. Here's our albums table. We'll start with select all from albums. Here's the person ID. And what we want to do, the first step is to join a second table. So we start with albums, and now we're going to join our persons table. Once we do that, things get pretty hairy, kind of messed up. The issue is SQL doesn't know how it's supposed to align person ID, how it is supposed to combine these two tables. You can see right here we have the person ID, but it's linking up with the primary key of 1. Person ID is 2. But it's linking up with the primary key of 1 from the persons table. Here it got it right, I guess. Here, again, it's messing up. Person ID is 2. It's linking up with the primary key of 1. So we have to tell it what needs to equal what. We want this person ID table, person ID column, to equal the person's .id table column. So in other words, we want this column right here to align with this column right there. Okay? So how do we do that? We'll say join the persons table, but do it on the persons.id equaling the albums.personid. Now this works. I'm just going to pause and give you guys a minute to look over this. So notice that the person ID this time is linking up with the primary key of persons.id. And because of that, these rows are now aligning. Okay, so just to repeat this, what do? Let's do this again. You can start with just like a single select, and I always build these things in like steps. So select all from albums. What does that do? If we spell it correctly, all from albums, this just loads up a single table, right? Loads up all the records in the albums table. Then we join the second table, we'll join the persons table. So now what does this do? This loads up all the records in the persons table. The issue, of course, is that while we as humans know to align this value, person ID, with this value, the primary key of ID in persons, SQL isn't that smart. So you have to be explicit with it and say, hey, join persons on persons.id equals albums.personid. Align only, kind of combine the rows where this value equals this value. So where 2 equals 2. Questions about that? Notice what I'm doing here. I'm doing persons.id. This is called a table prefix. Literally, the table name is a prefix, right? It comes first before the column name. You can always, to specify a column, you can always specify the table name first. All right. In this case, I kind of have to, because once I join, I select from albums and I join persons, then now I'm loading up two tables simultaneously. Right? I'm loading up both the persons table and the albums table, and they both have an ID column. So I have to be specific and say, hey, I'm talking about this column right here, persons.id equaling albums.personid. Right. So Kumar is saying we're just joining on the foreign key. Yeah, we're saying the primary key here, persons.id, where the person's primary key should equal the album's foreign key. So albums.personid. Right? When this is a 2, I want this to be a 2. Right? And this is just saying, hey, Prince, the ID of Prince's ID is 2, so we want to see it here. Wherever we see person ID of 2, we want that artist that has the ID of 2. That's all you're telling SQL to do. The only other thing to state is from there, then you can notice we're getting all the columns from each of the tables, right? We're getting the ID of person. No, we're getting the ID of albums, ID of person, and then the name. Right? You can specify what columns you want, right? So doing select star, we can do albums dot name, comma, persons dot name, right? So it is still linking up on these foreign keys. We just don't see them right now because, like I said, this kind of happens last. This is the view. This is the information that's displayed back to you. You're saying, I just want to see the album's name and the artist's name. So this is how I would construct the query: is start with select star. So you can kind of see and confirm that these line up, and then you can specify the specific columns you want. Questions about this? You sure? Yeah. The main thing is like if you I like to like write out some sample data, or you can just do it in this Khan Academy thing, and you do select all from albums. Let's comment this out. Select all from persons. What I would say is like be able to do this with your brain first. Kind of like just like we learned about with Python. So how do we tell me, like the way that you might do this is to say, tell me the person that wrote this album, or let's say this one. Everyone can tell me that it's Prince, right? And then the next thing is, well, how do you know that? You're linking up this table, the albums table, and this table of persons, and then you're joining, combining them together, where, or another, in SQL parlance, right, on, where this value, the person ID, equals this thing. Sorry, the albums.person ID equals persons.id. So you just have to answer the question just like we did before, and then break it down into SQL language. Yeah, can you use group by and join at the same time? You can. Yeah. No, you can use group by. So if you want, we can take a look at that. So let's say we have select all from albums. So here's my albums. And then we'll join persons on, what is it going to be? Albums.personID equals persons.id. So now you have these two. What's next? Let's say we want to count how many times each of our artists, created an album. So what would you do? We group by, and I would group by, why can't I spell? The artist ID, or the person ID. So now we have one row for each record. And then we can say person ID name. Sorry, this would be our persons.name. Wait, is that not right? Oh yeah, it just doesn't like the comma. And then what else? Maybe a count star as number of albums. Okay. So it's like first we got together the data. First we joined this together. Right? Link these up. And then it's like now we're dealing with this table. Now that we have this table, just how would you find out how many times these were written? Well, you'd group by the person, right? In this case, you want to group by the ID, not the name. Basically, you always want to use some sort of ID because someone, we could have multiple artists with the same name. So now we just group by the person ID. And now you say, perform the aggregate, essentially. Select the commas you want and perform the aggregate. So select persons.name, comma, count, star, as amount of albums. Right, so I always do these things in steps, meaning like press shift return. Can you specify to only show people with the hometown of Minneapolis? Sure. Group by, so here it's the same type of thing. So let's, so this is now a different question. So what do we need if we want people, sorry, let's undo this. If we want people just with the hometown of Minneapolis, right? What do we need now? So we're linking these up. And now we probably want to put a where here. This is where hometown equals mini, I don't know if I can spell it. Hold on, let's take a look. Hometown equals this. So now we're just getting the albums here, right? And now you can, so we've linked up right? Here's the album name, here's the person name and their hometown, right? And maybe what we want to do is say, just give me the albums of people from Minneapolis, right? So what do we need? We just need maybe the album's name. So albums.name. So these are all the albums in our database written by people from Minneapolis. Okay. And again, that's a really nice question. Like, how do you answer something like that? What I would do in terms of problem solving is start by seeing the two tables, select all from persons, select all from albums, and then like have your brain answer the question. What are all the albums written by someone from Minneapolis? Well, to do this, you probably join these two tables together, right? Kind of like make these one really long table. And then you want to just select those rows. So you're like tacking on this information to the records here. And then you want to see just those rows where the hometown equals Minneapolis, right? So that you then just translate that process into SQL. Why don't I just use persons.hometown? Well, I can't, because if I want to see the albums, like the question is, why can't I just use persons.hometown? I mean, I cannot do this. Select all from persons where persons.hometown equals, Minneapolis. This would just give me Prince. I can't spell that word. Hold on. Right, if I do this, that just gives me Prince. Right? Like that's just the artist from there. But if I want to find the albums, all the albums written by somebody from Minneapolis, right? I need to join. Like I have this issue where the album information is here, but the hometown information is here. So I want to first link together these rows, right? So that's this then, where I first select all from albums, join persons on the person's ID equals the albums.person ID. So the first step is now I'm linking together these rows on where the person ID equals this ID. And then I can now say, just give me these albums, right? Where the hometown equals Minneapolis. All right, I'm going to let you guys practice this. I feel like this is something that mainly needs some practice, but we can review this afterwards if you want.